In the late 19th century, an eccentric musician, woodworker, and shoe salesman named Orville Gibson put Kalamazoo, Michigan on the map as the epicenter of American guitar and mandolin innovation. His designs, which were informed by close study of early violin family instruments, began to earn the admiration of players around the world by the late 1890s. They also garnered attention from investors in West Michigan, who paid Orville for the rights to his business, his name, and his patents in 1902. For several years, Orville worked at least part-time for Gibson, for which he was paid a salary of $500 a year. However, what Gibson biographer Julius Belson later described as eccentric behavior led eventually to his separation from the company and his return to family in New York State, where he passed away in 1918. But his modern designs had laid the foundation for the new Gibson Mandolin and Guitar Company, which has continued to make guitar history both in Kalamazoo and elsewhere for more than a century. In the early years, Gibson instruments closely reflected Orville's distinctive designs. For example, the hand-carved or arched tops and backs. But at the turn of the century, demand was rising rapidly for many instruments, including banjos. And the new fad of local mandolin and guitar orchestras also increased the market for an array of instruments. The growth that was fueled by this demand led Gibson to build a new factory at 225 Parsons Street in Kalamazoo. The new facility sat next to the railroad tracks, where wood could be offloaded directly into the lumber yard. And it featured modern windows that allowed in natural light from all directions. While 1918 brought the end of World War I and the spread of the Spanish flu pandemic, it also brought Gibson into its new home and saw the hiring of design engineer Lloyd Loar. Loar is celebrated for his F-style mandolin and for standardizing the company's flagship L5 acoustic guitar, the first of its kind with F-holes. Both were among the most popular stringed instruments of the Roaring '20s, and surviving instruments signed by Loar routinely fetch sums north of $100,000. Though the Great Depression decimated the American economy in the 1930s, blues, jazz, and hillbilly music all increased in popularity. The new Appalachian sounds of the Carter family and Bill Monroe, the modern swing jazz of Eddie Lang and Carl Kress, and the Delta blues of players like Robert Johnson are hallmark sounds in the history of early recorded American music, and all featured Gibson instruments. Yet two imperatives became obvious from the industry point of view during the Great Depression. Instruments needed to be more affordable during an era of economic hardship, and they needed to be able to compete with louder instruments like drums, woodwinds, pianos, and horns. The design and building of cheaper models, like the L00 flat-top acoustic, coupled with the arrival of the electric guitar pickup, helped to solidify Gibson's place in the history of 20th century music. Generations of future players would learn to play on relatively inexpensive Gibson instruments, purchased at dime stores or through catalogs, and guitar masters like Charlie Christian, Sister Rosetta Tharpe, and Les Paul and Mary Ford would now be able to amplify their sound. These made the guitar not only a mainstay in the boxcar, but on stage with the orchestra as well. By World War II, Kalamazoo was the largest producer of acoustic and electric guitars in the United States. But in order to help with the war effort, Gibson, like other manufacturers, altered their production for wartime industries. And while they did produce metal and wooden parts for the war effort, they also continued to employ some workers, most of whom were women, to build guitars. These Gibson gals produced thousands of the so-called banner guitars of the era, which featured the iconic headstock inlay, "Only a Gibson is good enough." In the decades after World War II, and after having been purchased by Chicago Musical Instruments, or CMI, in 1944, Gibson would embody several trends from that era in U.S. history: industrial growth, a growing workforce, sleek mid-century designs, and a correlation to the power and influence of popular music. Gibson quickly returned to its position at the forefront of electric and acoustic guitar design and manufacture, thanks in large part to its hiring of Ted McCarty as president in 1948 and to its partnership with guitarist Les Paul. They introduced the Les Paul model in 1952, which remains among the most popular and recognizable designs in American popular culture. While it followed the lead of industry competitors like Rickenbacker and Fender, who had introduced solid-body electric guitars in the 1940s, the Les Paul retained a distinctive Gibson look, and, as Les Paul and Mary Ford would illustrate in hundreds of recordings and thousands of performances, his namesake guitar could produce remarkable new tones in the hands of master players. The Les Paul and other new models also required new innovations in hardware and pickup design. Gibson had introduced the P90 single-coil pickup in 1946, an upgrade from the earlier Charlie Christian design, and P90s graced the earliest Les Paul models. But in the mid-1950s, designer Seth Lover developed the humbucking pickup, the earliest version of which is known affectionately by guitar enthusiasts as the PAF, or Patent Applied For. This humbucking double-coil pickup allowed guitarists to achieve much louder volumes with great tone and sustain, and without the 60-cycle hum that was a constant with single-coil pickups. Similarly, new designs helped electric guitars achieve greater precision and flexibility. Gibson's stop tailpiece and two-nomatic bridge gave players more options for adjusting their instrument's intonation, its ability to remain in tune up and down the neck. And the introduction of Paul Bigsby's new vibrato tailpiece to Gibson instruments raised the bar once again and linked a sleek, modern design to great functionality and sound. As rock and roll became the soundtrack of the 1950s, guitarists like Chuck Berry, Bill Haley, and Link Wray all made memorable music on Gibson instruments. And increasingly, their guitars were being heard through Gibson speakers as the company expanded to produce several lines of vacuum tube amplifiers. Remaining modern was also important in the late 1950s, when Gibson introduced the semi-hollow body ES-335, the thin archtop Birdland, and several futuristic guitar designs like the Flying V, the Explorer, and the appropriately named Moderne. And the company added further to its product line and production capacity by acquiring rival guitar maker Epiphone, and by building a massive addition to its main factory at 225 Parsons Street. In the worlds of the jazz guitar, as well as country, folk, and rockabilly music, Gibson instruments continued to make the music, while the company churned out new archtop and flat-top guitars, and basses, and mandolins, banjos, pedal steels, Hawaiian lap steels, and more. In the realm of the flat-top guitar, Gibson's J45 and Hummingbird Dreadnought offered strong competition to Martin & Company, America's oldest producer of flat-top acoustic guitars. And whatever the instrument, each time a pioneering player like Doc Watson or Kenny Burrell Sister Rosetta Tharpe, or Elvis Presley, or the Beatles, chose to play a Gibson or an Epiphone, interest in Kalamazoo-produced instruments soared. By the 1960s, popular music was a massive cultural phenomenon, and with it came seemingly ever-increasing demand for guitars and other stringed instruments produced in Kalamazoo. By the end of the decade, Gibson employees numbered over 1,000, and often more than 300 instruments per day entered the world via the north side of Kalamazoo. And while the future looked bright in the mid-1960s, Gibson was about to change ownership again as the end of an era approached. By the late 1960s, Gibson was producing hundreds of guitars each day. Demand for those instruments was high, and the company expanded again in 1968. The future looked so bright that a South American brewery conglomerate called ECL bought the company in 1969. Of the late 1960s and the 1970s became difficult to disentangle from the sounds and images of Gibson guitars. Robbie Krieger playing his SG as Jim Morrison is arrested on stage in Miami. Carlos Santana with his SG at Woodstock. John Lennon with an Epiphone on a London rooftop. Keith Richards playing Under My Thumb on a sunburst Les Paul as an audience member is stabbed at Altamont. Most people's first impressions of hard rock and heavy metal and glam rock in the early 1970s involved a Gibson Les Paul or an SG. In Martin Scorsese's documentary The Last Waltz, which brought together some of the greatest musicians in the history of rock and roll, there were no less than 6 instruments on stage with the band at the Winterland Ballroom that were built in Kalamazoo, Michigan. ECL, soon to change its name to Norlin, had every reason to expect that this place in popular culture would drive sales forever.
Do you play do you actually play all these, or?
Well, I play them and I cherish them. Mm-hmm. This is at the top of the heap right here. There's no question about it. Look at the flame on that one.
Yes.
Look, I mean, it's quite unbelievable. This one is just it's perfect. 1959. It just you can listen.
How much is
just
this?
Listen for a minute. Sustain. Listen to it.
I'm not hearing anything.
You would though if it were playing because it really. It's famous for its sustain. I mean, you can just hold it.
Yet even as their popularity rose, demand for new guitars began to flatten, and competitors like Guild and Paul Reed Smith and a host of Asian guitar makers grabbed shares of that ebbing market away from Gibson. Norlin, seeking to cut costs and perhaps escape the strong union presence in Kalamazoo, began moving production to Nashville, Tennessee. By the early 1980s, only a skeleton crew remained at Parsons Street as a sort of custom shop. Gibson closed the plant for good in 1984. While most historians cite poor management and declining quality for the drop in demand for Gibson instruments in the 1980s, others point to the fact that in leaving Kalamazoo, Gibson left behind hundreds of skilled employees. West Michigan likely had one of the highest guitar makers per capita populations in the world. Leaving them behind was bound to hurt quality and productivity. And while they were proud of their work, most were unwilling to move to Nashville to work for non-union wages, preferring to remain in Kalamazoo and move on to other careers. Their friends and families and bowling leagues and local pubs were in Kalamazoo, not in Nashville. Nostalgia has become perhaps the most potent force in the world of guitar buying, playing, selling, and collecting. Among the most sought-after and expensive instruments in the world are those that were made in Kalamazoo. A Lloyd Loar signed mandolin, for example, or a 1959 Les Paul Sunburst. and almost all years and models of made in Kalamazoo instruments increase or at least hold their value. This makes for tough competition for modern guitar makers. Even before the move to Nashville, 225 Parsons Street had become a sort of mecca for guitarists and admirers. Elvis had been in the building. Johnny and June Carter Cash had come to Parsons Street, story has it, with their upright bass on top of their station wagon in need of a repair. Stories about Chet Atkins and Keith Richards, Emmylou Harris, Willie Nelson and Merle Travis. They had all come to Kalamazoo, had seen the employees making the instruments, and had been awed by the experience. And what other industry could boast a workforce who would, even after they were downsized out of their careers, talk fondly for decades about the work they had done? The paper industry? The pill industry? The taxi cab industry? These didn't create the same type of loyalty. But having made guitars seems to have filled Kalamazooans with great pride. It gave the town a happy story, if with a sad ending. And ever since, generations of their children and grandchildren get to see players around the world valuing and continuing to make music on the instruments they made here in Kalamazoo. The final part of our story of Gibson and Kalamazoo is the long legacy of guitar making that followed the 1984 plant closure. Many former employees went on to long careers making stringed instruments, performing difficult repairs and restorations, and passing on their knowledge to the next generation of luthiers. First and foremost among these was Heritage Guitar Incorporated, which simply continued to make guitars right there in the same building and on much of the same equipment. 4 former employees, Jim Durlew, J.P. Motes, Marv Lamb, and Bill Page, leased the basement floor of the original 1918 factory, purchased some of the equipment that Gibson was leaving behind, and proceeded to build their own line of solid body, semi-hollow body, and custom-carved archtop guitars that all echoed the Gibson instruments they had made for so long.
I had the opportunity to go to Nashville, Yeah, I had the opportunity. They wanted me to move into Nashville even then, and everything, and I still wouldn't go, I said, no, I'm staying, I'll take my chances and do it. But we had decided that what we were going to do is what we knew how to do best. Yeah. We were going to try to build guitars. So we come up with the name of Heritage, and we just kind of done our own thing, and we moved into this building, like I said, April 1st, and then incorporated. We probably moved in a little bit before that, but we incorporated April Fool's Day 1985. And we've been doing it now, 27 years. Yeah, so I've been doing this for 56 years, long time.
You got it figured out yet?
No, you never figure out guitar building.
A small operation, Heritage handcrafted thousands of guitars in much the same manner that vintage Kalamazoo guitars had been made. This authenticity is exactly what many enthusiasts seek. A Heritage guitar, made in Kalamazoo, right there in the factory, by former employees using vintage techniques, makes more sense to some players and collectors than buying any other modern guitar, which can be attested to by the popularity of the Heritage Owners Club. In fact, during the early years at Heritage, Durlew, Motes, Lamb, and Page, and their small staff were able to produce many custom-carved instruments for which Gibson, now resettled in Nashville, lacked the expertise.
The Gibson guitar isn't made here anymore. The operation moved to Nashville 10 years ago. But this is still a guitar factory. J.P. Motes built Gibson guitars for nearly 30 years. Now his factory turns out 1,500 Heritage guitars a year. He says it still takes a steady hand to make a quality instrument.
It takes a lot of skill to build guitars. It's to get the sound and to get them to note true and all that stuff. It's there's some pretty critical work into it.
This place is magical.
Wild Bill Durkin moved here from New York to be near the guitar factory. He calls it a labor of love, the job of turning this place into a recognized national landmark. In Kalamazoo, Bert Mosley, WOTV 41 News.
Tomorrow, Gibson guitar enthusiasts will gather to dedicate the factory as a National Historic Landmark. In a few months, it's expected to be included in the National Register of Historic Places.
More recently, Heritage Guitar and the historic building it occupies were purchased by international investors who plan to preserve both modern guitar making and the physical building on the north side of Kalamazoo. Meanwhile, dozens of former Gibson employees either went on to work with Heritage Guitar or else struck out on their own. Aaron Cowles, for example.
And just for folks who don't know, Aaron is the proprietor of Aaron's Music Service in Vicksburg, Michigan.
Pete Moreno turned the basement of an old schoolhouse in Oshtemo, Michigan into his famous guitar clinic. Abraham Wechter moved into an old building in nearby Paw Paw, Michigan, where, for several decades, he manufactured Wechter guitars before moving on to build custom guitars overseas. Maudie Moore, an engraver with Gibson starting in 1962, has continued to do custom work for numerous guitar makers out of her home workshop.
UPS, they deliver it to me, and I do the engraving, and if they want some truss rod cover, mother of pearl truss rod covers cut, I cut that, and if they want them personalized, I still personalize them, and so I have parts sitting in my shop right now. But I never knew anything about engraving and inlay work until I worked there at Gibson, so I'm very appreciative of the Gibson Guitar Company. It's been my life.
As layoffs mounted in the 1970s and 80s, some Gibson employees just found other jobs. Yet many continued to feel a bond with their time at Gibson, whether through friendships with former coworkers or through the degree of pride they carried with them from having worked there.
This guy's eyes just got big, and he come tearing out there, "Gibson, where did you get that shirt?" And I said, "Well, I used to work there." And he said, "Oh man," he said, and he whips this thing back, and there's a Gibson guitar, you know. And people who play instruments probably think that there's nothing like them. Gibson made some beautiful guitars. I mean, they were, the finish on them and everything was, they were just beautiful. You know.
Well, you get instruments sent from all over the world, I guess, wouldn't you?
I got to meet a lot of people that way, and even met like Les Paul and Merle Travis, different people like that. I worked on Merle's,
I wanted
a couple
to.
of his.
Now, was that the big Super 400 with the long Bigsby
He
tobacco
brought that in
sunburst?
once where the rim was cracked all the way around just about. And he was pretty hard on guitars.
I bet he was.
And he left it there to be repaired, and while it was being repaired, they gave him a bright red. I remember it was a Super 400. And they had me put a Bigsby on it for him before he left.
And that was the long Merle Travis
Yeah, I don't
Bigsby
remember
with
if
the
he
ring.
put that one on, but we had him put it on there, had me put it on there, and he was going to Canada for the weekend to do some fairs. Because I'll never forget, this was a brand new guitar. And he went to Canada. He come back the next week, about a Wednesday, I think, because he wanted his single coil pickups in there.
Being P90s?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I looked at the back, and it was just all scratched, and I thought, boy, I really like his playing, but I don't think I want him playing my guitar.
Well, you know, that guitar that you talk about that you repaired is now in the Country Music Hall of Fame, as I understand. Yeah.
I did the final setup, you know. The repairmen did the rim work and stuff.
Was he playing round wounds or flat wounds, you remember?
There were also numerous businesses that thrived in proximity to Gibson that have continued to play a role in the music industry. Proco shared space in the old factory with Heritage for decades. Former Gibson president Ted McCarty bought Bigsby vibratos and built its Kalamazoo line on the east side of town for years. And Dean Markley, American Winding, and GHS have produced millions of sets of strings in the greater Kalamazoo area. And today, a new generation of guitar makers is keeping the tradition of guitar innovation and production alive. In addition to Heritage Guitar hiring new and many younger employees and training them in modern factory production, Kalamazoo is home to several luthiers who learned their trade from former Gibson makers and continue to employ both vintage and modern guitar making techniques. Steve Cowles has taken over his father's shop in Vicksburg. Rye Charters of Caltone studied with Abe Wechter and Jim Derlew before starting his own business. Each fretboard festival finds dozens of makers with similar stories roaming the halls of the Kalamazoo Valley Museum and reconnecting with a type of social cohort that likely exists in only a few places on Earth. And guitar makers have stories to tell.